I'm here today with Dr. Merrimon Cuninggim, who is on our campus, lives today in Baltimore, Maryland. As many of you know, he has been a student many years of his life. He attended Vanderbilt University, Duke University. He attended Yale University and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. You've been a professor of religion. You've been a chaplain. You've worked at Denison University. You've worked at Pomona. You've been the dean of Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. And most people know you from the time you served as president of the Danforth Foundation. And there, of course, you were very interested in values in higher education.
You left out my coaching the championship tennis team at Pomona.
I did leave that out. That's for another conversation.
All right,
we'll do
all
athletics,
right,
next week. As I mentioned to you this morning, we have formed at DePauw University a United Methodist Council. We're very interested in enhancing the relationship between this university and the church. We formed our council about the time your book, Uneasy Partners, came out. And so we've helped your retirement income by buying a copy of the book for all the people on our council. We have both lay people and clergy on the council. And they're reading the book in preparation for our meeting in May. We would have liked to have had you with us in that meeting, but it couldn't be worked out with your calendar as busy as it is in your retirement. But we're delighted to have you here, and we'll be able to play this tape and this interview for our council, so it'll give you an opportunity to be as provocative as you would like to be without having to answer questions from any of the people around the table.
Perfect situation.
Perfect. In the early part of your book, you analyzed something that I think several people have observed, that there was a time when the church really had the dominant role over the college. Certainly that was the case here, the church founding the college for very specific reasons. And then after a time in history, in through the 50s, the 1950s or so, a time developing when the college and the church were more equal partners. And now you characterize the situation we're in today as really the college being in the primary position. And the church in, I think you called it a junior role. Comment on that just a little in terms of the way we are relating to each other and what a college's responsibility is if it's church related and is in more of a senior role than the church. Say a little about what you meant by that.
This has got to be broad brush. You can't set specific dates even for an individual institution when it moved from junior partnership to equal partnership to senior partnership. You can't set precise dates. And thus for the group of colleges as a whole, of the whole vast array of over 700, of all denominations and so on, you can only take the position, it seems to me, that this is the trend, has been the trend, is identifiable, but is not so precise as to be able to be, so to say, measured. Now, in many of the colleges, you referred to DePauw being founded by the Methodist Church. In many colleges, the college was necessarily junior. It was founded by, it was the child who didn't know how to walk. And it would be altogether appropriate for the church to take the lead and to set the patterns and to define the parameters. As time went on, a college discovered that if it were to live with its own kind, its other colleges and so on, it had to be, at least in part, master of its own particular behavior and destiny. And so the colleges began to assert themselves. They chose the faculty one way or another, not the church. They had a larger share in choosing the president, not the church, and so on. And there were many developments, especially around the middle of the century, in nearly all denominations. As a matter of fact, this was when the Catholic colleges first began to show some sign of following in their Protestant counterparts' footsteps a bit, because they began to trust laymen more. Father Paul Reinert at St. Louis University was, I think, the first president of a Catholic institution to shift his institution to a lay board, a board which had members of the Society of Jesus on it, to be sure, but was a lay board. As these latter years have come to pass, more and more it has been understood that the college had to have its own autonomy in academic matters. This has not meant a necessity to leave the church or to fail to abide by the church's interests and wishes. In many instances, it's led to a stronger tie between the college and the church than had been true for, say, 50 or 75 years. But I think it is a trend that we can trust, even though I couldn't possibly say, give you a date for even the colleges that I know minutely.
But one of the things that's happened at DePauw through the years is the composition of our board has changed.
Yes.
We have far more lay people on the board than we do clergy. We have maintained our relationship in that 25% of our board is required to be United Methodist. Of course, that's very different from what it used to be.
Yes.
I think we are very intent on keeping our tradition, but it's more difficult to define now than it used to be. We find ourselves wondering sometimes on the council, how is it, what ways are there for colleges like DePauw to show an appreciation of their history? I mean, we have the Methodist name on all of our literature. The chaplain of the college is a Methodist. But I dare say, I'm sure we have students who aren't aware that this was a Methodist college, and we certainly have faculty who would say they didn't come here because of its church relationship. How does a college in this kind of environment show its appreciation for its history?
By being, first of all, the best college it can be. But your question rises out of a kind of sensitivity to its past that the church-related college tends to feel all across the country and in other denominations, a sensitivity that says we were once supposed to show marks, signs, actual expectations in black and white that we were Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, Presbyterian, whatever. And now we don't do that anymore. Oh me, are we becoming less so than once? And it's a sort of, the raising of the question is to me a sort of observance of the past, longing for something of the past, and being a little sorry that those earlier marks of identification no longer hold. Now, I happen to believe that those earlier marks of identification were not the real thing. They were the thing that we often trumpeted. President is always of our church. So many faculty must be, and so on. We have 3 required chapels a week, and all the rest of the little signs. But the fact of the matter is that the temper, the atmosphere, that elusive spirit of the institution is hard to define, but much more reliable as an indicator of whether the college takes the church seriously. Let me illustrate by going outside our own church, because I happen to be a Methodist too, and have long known DePauw for its being a staunch institution in the Methodist community. The institutions that over a period of time seem to me to have been most successful in striking this note of temper or atmosphere are, I'm sorry to say this, the Quaker institutions. None of them goes out of its way to raise up a banner on the edge of the campus, "Go to now, we are Quakers," you see. But there is something about these colleges that takes with the students, that fits with the Quakers' own understanding of their relationship to their faith, and that spills over. Even if an awful lot of the students don't turn Quaker, it does affect their lives. Well, now, I don't mean to say they're the only ones that do this. I certainly don't mean to say that it doesn't happen in institutions that you and I know closely, the Methodists, it does. But I think it is at least a good illustration of what I'm trying to say about this matter, that we've gone beyond the time of specific marks. And when we begin to say the college seeks to expose its students of all faiths to the kind of values that the college and its church believe in. And as it does that, it's being the best United Methodist College that it can be, or any other one. I don't know whether that makes any sense or not. It isn't nice and straight and 1, 2, 3, but that's what I believe.
Well, one of the things I've wondered about, certainly DePauw has changed over the last 50 years a great deal. We used to be predominantly a white institution.
Yes.
We now have about 17% of our students who are minority students. We have other...
17?
17.
That's very good.
We have other signs of modernity in that we have a director of Jewish study and thought on our campus who is a rabbi. We have an Asian studies program. So one could argue, and in fact some conservative lay people could argue, that we've become very, very broad. At the same time, I think most people who study the history of the Methodist Church realize it affirms very liberal social principles, has become very broad over its history. Could it be that one of the reasons Methodist colleges struggle in particular is that the church is a very broad-minded church? Its colleges tend to be very broad-minded colleges, and it's difficult to come up with those concrete kinds of connections, and so we find ourselves having a lot of conversations like this among ourselves. Well, what symbols do fit for us, or what is appropriate?
I think you've posed this question by beginning with a reference to diversity in a way that makes it easy to answer in one sense and very difficult to answer in another. When you said 17% a minute ago for DePauw's figure of minority or minority students, I replied, that's very good. It's not very good. You and I know that. But there are an awful lot of people that don't know that and would protest at its being that high. It's very good in comparison with what most colleges have done and are doing. But we've still got a good long way to go. And to sketch out the dimensions of how far most colleges have got to go to affirm just that one, not to speak of many another social concern or conclusion one draws about society because of one's faith background. This is a very tricky proposition. We've got a community back of us. Every church-related college I know has got a community back of it that finds it difficult to go as far in respect to some kinds of social problems as the college feels it must go, not just wants to go, but has already begun to stretch in that direction. The college of the church is indeed the forerunner of that church, almost any, in respect to what the church itself ought to be thinking of and hoping for the development of its own people. We can see this in a other kinds of institutions, perhaps sometimes easier than we can see it or admit it, in respect to our own, the Methodists. The colleges of the extreme right-wing religious groups, and they do have some, are almost without exception a step or two ahead of their own churches in speaking to the issues of their time. Certainly it's true in nearly all Catholic colleges. There are a few captives, so to say, off in a corner that haven't caught on to the new day and are not giving the church any trouble. But most Catholic institutions are on the firing line. And I think it is to DePauw's great glory that it has taken this position for a long, long time, and is still taking the position that what we try to do with our own students is to begin to give a glimpse of where the church is going in the immediate future. Now, I don't know that I have spoken to your problem at all, but it seems to me that that's involved.
Well, one of the things I liked about your analysis and the way it might relate to civil rights or what campus is called now, diversifying their student bodies.
Yes.
I can remember growing up in Alabama, the church, and in particular the Methodist Church, was among the most progressive churches in the South, pushing for desegregation and so on. And it was there that you heard, if you please, the demands of the gospel placed and change called for. And in a sense, the college got its marching orders from the church.
Yes.
In that sense.
Yes.
Now we're in the 90s, and even though I would agree with you that it's pretty poor that we only have, you might say, 17% minority, the colleges can turn to the churches, though, and say, well,
come along.
Where are you?
Yes, where are you?
And
come join
maybe
us.
Maybe that's helpful, but without sort of standing on a soapbox and damning the churches for what Martin Luther King called the most segregated hour in America, being the Sunday morning worship services. Do you see, or have you thought of ways that a college like DePauw, related to the Methodist Church, particularly in Indiana, could enhance a dialogue with the church about race relations? Certainly they're worse in our country than, or many think they're worse now than they've been in several years. Is this an area of opportunity, do you think?
You could raise that question in many other areas of current concern, besides just race relations, of course, as you're well aware of. And it's always so easy to say the college ought to be prepared to take the lead. The difficulty is, if and as a college does so, it exposes itself to the fire of those who don't understand, who haven't been brought along in the churches, and certainly are not prepared for their dear college to expose itself to some of these things. And so one of the answers, I think, to your question is that the colleges of each denomination must learn to work together much closer for their own protection and for the protection of the thing they believe in than they've ever done before. The colleges of other denominations must work together much closer than they have. I think that the Methodist group has a cohesiveness that many others don't, so far as I'm aware. But I think that they could use a good bit more, because some colleges in some parts of the church think they've escaped some of these problems that you might say you still feel are important here, and vice versa, other problems. And it's as they get together and work together. The Catholic colleges are doing it as never before. Presbyterian colleges are trying to do it. Nearly all the groups are, and certainly that's one thing. Another thing I think that it is important is the colleges, because the college's whole pattern can't be one of cooperation with other schools away. You've got to be able to do something on your own with your own people right there. And I always think that one thing that is important is making sure that the people in one's own constituency who genuinely do not understand some position that the college feels it must take have had first-hand and careful opportunity to understand with the college people. You mentioned race relations. It happens by chance that my wife and I were involved in the first major business of that sort, desegregation of any institution in higher education, and it was 2 years before the Supreme Court decision. And we had an awful lot in our community that didn't understand what we were doing. We did some things right, but one of the things we didn't do as well as we should have, and it would have made things even better than they did turn out to be, was work closely with the disaffected in our own church, in our own city, in our own state. It was so inviting. It was too easy to condemn them. Oh, these people, they don't understand, and we've got to serve our conscience and do what's right. And we didn't do as much of that as we should. I think that is a terribly important factor, too.
Serving the disaffected is, or working with the disaffected, I think is a challenge to all of us, particularly in this society. I mentioned race relations.
Yeah.
Most colleges, most church-related colleges have what the conservative wing of the church would call very liberal policies about gay rights, women's rights, and sometimes this conservative arm really doesn't want to be in a conversation with you about those things.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
And so I think that may be where we find ourselves a lot of times, which brings me to my next question, really, which is a follow-up. Now, you cited the church-related colleges has three distinctive characteristics, and I think you're right. I think we need to have a sense of our past. I think anyone who studies DePauw very carefully would say that we do. We would argue that we practice our academic values, as you call on us to do in the book, and we are hoping that we have a defensible relationship with the church.
I agree with all that you've said, incidentally.
But with practicing academic values, you mentioned truth and freedom and justice. Those are values that I would think any college would have, and you would find those words in the catalog and so on. But you also mentioned kinship. And in all candor, I was probably more interested in that value than the others, because I've thought about that a great deal and how difficult it is to define that kinship and live it out in such a pluralistic way, when some might argue that the college campus is a terribly fragmented sort of place now, with all the pluralism, and then to lay over on top of that a need to have a kinship with the church to talk about these issues. Say a little about kinship and your philosophy of it, and how kinship at a church-related college is different from the kinship one might find at Indiana University.
Well, you've touched upon one of the parts of my book that was quite difficult for me. I didn't want the word kinship there. I was trying to state the minimum, the necessity of those values that applied to the college as an educational institution. Obviously, those aren't all the values that peoples or groups of religious faith want to show. There are others as well, but a college can't get along with truth, can't get along without freedom, can't get along without, with truth, without freedom, or without justice. It'd be a shambles to imagine a college that affirmed the opposites, even though the college doesn't always live up to it. But there is this other thing that I was trying to grasp, and the word I played with most of the time I was working on this manuscript was relatedness. Well, it's a polysyllabic word for one thing, and it's awkward, and I wanted something a little sharper than that. But further, it didn't quite affirm that the relationship, the relatedness, was in a sense automatic, was generic. It went back to the heart of things. And the idea of kinship seemed to me to serve both sides of the idea I was trying to make, namely, that in the academic world, all scholars are kin. Not just scholars at DePauw, not just scholars at DePauw with Indiana U and Notre Dame, but all scholars all across the world are kin. And the other kind is all subjects are kin. We can't gather for ourselves alone any particular bit of scholarship that is produced on our campus. We can't do it. There isn't any such thing as a church-related piece of chemical invention or anything else you see. We've got to share it. It's got to be shared. It's part of the business of being who we are. And so I lit upon the word kinship to try to say that. I'm not sure it really does say it as I would like it said, but to try to say it, because I believe it very firmly about the institutions. You said all colleges have got to have this. You are right. If and when one were to say, we are a church-related college because we believe in truth, we practice freedom, we insist on justice, and we feel kin to the whole world, and the state university right down the corner or down the road has got to say the same thing, then what is the difference? The difference, in my view, is one of degree, not of kind, but it is a very important degree, because the base faith, I suppose, the base belief that the church-related college rests in is that these values are rooted in the universe itself. And non-church people might indeed have the same faith personally, but the institution per se, independent, tax-supported, whatever, doesn't have to believe it that. And thus the urgency on the church college is, in my view, greater. All colleges ought to believe in truth, freedom, justice, and kinship, but the church colleges have got to. They can't get away. That's where they were born. They may not have known it. The church may not have known it then, but that's where they were born. And so it's theirs. Well, that was the line of my thought. It's not easy to try to put into practice, and I wouldn't try to pretend that any college I've ever known has put it into practice.
Mm-hmm. One of the things in closing this conversation that I've thought about several times, and I think the argument could be made by this college with the church, is that so many of the things we're committed to today come out of our historic relationship with the Methodist Church and what the church has been committed to, the values of, as you were saying, truth and freedom and justice, and particularly moving and using our resources in such a way to become more inclusive, that these are religious values that the church has celebrated before.
Yes.
Now, I also would say, and this is my own analysis because I've tried to sort this out in my mind, I've asked myself often the question, I implicitly ask you, we talked about state universities, but I've wondered, how is DePauw, as a Methodist-related, a church-affiliated institution, any different from other small colleges? What do we do this, because we do have faculty, as I said, who come here, who could care a great deal about the fact it's church-related, and who could care less about it being church-related, very pluralistic. And one of the things I've worked out in my own mind is to say that at the university, at a church-related university, We are loyal to truth, freedom, justice, and kinship, just as you described. But we have students at state-supported institutions or at small liberal arts colleges that are not related to the church may have, should have, value-oriented questions raised for them. They should become more sensitive, but we just have to be more intentional about it, almost so that we, if you please, not in a superficial way, that we guarantee that happens to the young people who come here. Now, they have every freedom to be Jews or Gentiles or men or women or Muslims or whatever, but we guarantee that we raise in whatever these
questions.
Well said. Is that a decent definition of a church-related college?
Yes. Well said. I think I would want to add only one little thing, and not in any sense to differ with the outline you've just given. You said we've got to be intentional about this, or you used the word intention in respect to how the college behaves. I agree. The only real danger I see is that we have become, in both the church and the college through the years, I think we have become so used to being glib about our intentions that we're likely to talk about them too much and to do about them too little. I don't think that a church-related college that takes these things that we've been talking about seriously ought to wear it on its as a chip on its shoulder, ought to speak of it every time it turns around. I was looking at some of the DePauw literature before I came to have this visit with you, and it seems to me that you folks do a very sensitive job of mentioning what it is you believe in enough so that nobody can fail to believe it, but not riding it so hard as to make it unattractive by very virtue of your having said it so often. I don't think that the trumpeting of these things is the thing that makes them live. And somehow we've got to find both the willingness and desire to put our intention about these things into practice, and our discipline to keep from talking about them at every turn so as to kill them in the process. I haven't said that very well, but I think perhaps you get what I mean, and I do agree with the way you said it a minute ago.
Well, I said that would be my last question, but let me ask one more. It's not so much a question as a statement I'd like to get you to react to. A lot of people have sort of signaled the end of the small college because we have very difficult times financially, most of us. We struggle for students and financial aid. But on a very different level, shouldn't this be an exciting time for the church-related college? Exciting in the sense that if one views the political landscape today and all the talk, some correct and some misspeaking, about family values, about affirmative action, about race relations, about the need for community, about the need to define those common things that would hold us together as a country, shouldn't that be a wonderful opportunity for the college to be intentional, not wearing its feelings on its sleeve as you were discussing, but shouldn't these be exciting times for church-related colleges? And I promise that's my last question.
Well, I hesitate not because I have any hesitation about what the answer to your question is. I hesitate because it seems to me to be so obvious that I feel as if you have touched that reflex that makes the answer come out, whether I've thought about it or not. Of course it's an exciting time. It is a time of great danger, of many serious problems. Many colleges are not going to make it, in my view. But when all of the humdrum disaster portents are noted and discussed ad infinitum, there still remains the fact that the kind of institution that happens, by chance but also by intent, to have sprung up all over this country, an institution that treasures, acknowledges and treasures its church relationship, that possesses its own autonomy and is trying to exercise it as best it can, that is serious about some of these academic values. An institution like that is an exciting place to be today and in the immediate future. Oh, yes.
Very good.
I don't want to fail to say the yes just because it's so obviously the thing to be said.
Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us
Well,
today
this has
in
been fun.
Greencastle. Maybe this is an interesting symbol, in fact, of the way the world has changed, that you'll be present in our meeting via technology, and we sit here in our beautiful Center for Contemporary Media with all the technology that this college did not have available to it 50 years ago, talking about some very traditional subjects.
I once gave a commencement address at DePauw, and it isn't what it is now. My.
Well,
This was back in the 60s. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. This was great fun.